Hello, and welcome to another episode of Stories for Grown-Ups. My name is Stephen Burnett, and I'd like to tell you the story of some work I was doing for an expedition ship in Central and South America. This started out as a relatively benign trip, interesting, rather creative, and with a couple of minor challenges ahead. But we did have a couple of wrinkles, which was the plan to circumnavigate all of South America from Tierra del Fuego to the Falkland Islands, up to Panama, down the Orinoco River. And one of the unexpected challenges was the issue of fueling, because the ship had rather small fuel tanks and we needed to find a stop somewhere down the west coast of Colombia between Panama and Ecuador. Cartagena in Colombia I have always enjoyed. I love this magnificent walled city. The standard of the restoration is absolutely stunning, and the cobblestones of the ancient street are so clean you could almost use them as a barbecue. Agent from Venezuela had flown into Cartagena for a sensitive discussion about taking the ship up the Orinoco. And this was the time when we were having bellicose anti-Western comments from President Hugo Chavez, who at the time was threatening business people in Venezuela with nationalization, stressing families, stressing businesses themselves, and concern for the future of their children. Cartagena is dominated by a large fort which is cleverly constructed around complex defense architecture which incorporates several ingenious booby traps. And when our guide started talking about that international bandit, Sir Francis Drake, I was stunned to hear this heresy, because Sir Francis was the hero of every English schoolboy. So what was he talking about? Mind you, history tends to depend on who is telling the story, and as truth is the first casualty of war, the story about Sir Francis Drake, a hero to English schoolboys, might not be the same for residents of Cartagena, where he was a marauding bandit. It's curious to contemplate, I have to say. But looking at our plans to cruise down the Pacific coastline of South America for a shallow draft vessel was exciting, because the increasingly larger cruise ships are becoming destinations unto themselves, and monster ships with 4,000 or 5,000 passengers plus another 2,000 crew have few ports that they can enter. This leaves many interesting smaller ports free for shallow draft vessels. Coastal ports of South America offer some wonderful opportunities for inland touring, but the port of Buenaventura in Colombia might not be the place to base this, because the area had been plagued with violent factions. At that time, the most well-known kidnapping was that of Ingrid Betancourt, the French-born member of the Colombian government, who was kidnapped in 2002 and incarcerated until 2008. There have been many discussions probing the background of that remarkable rescue operation, and there's some opinion that a splinter group of the FARC allowed the Colombian forces, with help from outside intelligence, I have to think, to rescue Betancourt and 14 other hostages. I have friends in Colombia who have a colleague who was kidnapped several years ago by the FARC, and the unfortunate victim was missing for several years with absolutely no contact or indication that he was alive. One day he was simply spotted strolling along the oceanfront in Cartagena, absolutely and abruptly freed by the rebel factions for reasons that were never entirely made clear. We were not willing to assume any risks with the guests on this ship, and the insurers might have objected to a port call in this area. So we now had a planning issue, which was to locate an interesting port of call on the Colombian coastline to break up the cruise journey between Panama and Ecuador. We needed to find fuel. I always travel with a tiny, powerful GPS loaded with a set of world maps. And sitting in Panama Airport, it was evident that a solution might be open to us if I could somehow cross the Colombian mainland and travel down to the coastal town of Guapi to take a first-hand look. But as the land route to this region was marginal because of the unrest, we decided to use an interesting option. Satena, a local regional airline run by the Colombian Air Force, had been established to service some of the underdeveloped regions of the country. And not only was Satena the only game in town, it was the only safe way to get to Guapi, where my adventure would begin. The Dornier 328 is an excellent aircraft. It's a short-field capable aircraft, quite tough, and ideal transportation to the region during these troubled times. We could really appreciate the challenges posed by transportation, and Satena was an excellent solution to my problem. On arrival in Guapi, there was virtually no transportation from this third world airport into the nearby town, but everyone seemed to be riding on the pillion of someone else's motorbike, and that seemed like the thing to do. My suitcase was safely tucked in the hotel back in Cartagena, and I was traveling with my number 3 backpack, so I put my newly acquired duty-free camera in the pack, and I had the benefit of a local organization which helped me find my way into town. They sandwiched me between 2 other motorbikes, but it was not quite clear if this was my close protection unit or just staff wanting to come along for the ride. The focus of the trip was to somehow visit a Colombian island known as Isla Gorgona, or Island of Gorgona, a curious place which my GPS chart plotter had identified while I was in Panama. The basic idea was to see if we could safely bring a ship into Gorgona for a unique visit onto this wonderful, overgrown, tropical, mountainous island. As you can imagine, there was no regular service out to Gorgona, so my plan was to get a decent night's sleep and early next morning walk along the waterfront, try and rent a boat for the trip out to the island. To do this, I'd somehow have to acquire not only the boat, but to stuff it full of fuel and water and set off for the island as best I can with whatever help I could find. Strolling along the waterfront, I watched villagers emerging from the jungle on the opposite bank, paddling tiny dugout canoes into the main channel. The market This waterfront beggar such as I had little choice, and in no time flat we'd closed the deal, but renting the boat and an older 140 horsepower Yamaha was only the first step. We needed a couple of 100 gallons of gas, 5 litres of oil, a couple of spare tanks, and a substantial supply of food, as we really didn't know how long the round trip was going to take. My GPS chart plotter indicated a distance of 45 nautical miles one way, virtually due west from Guapi, with a beam sea running from north to south and a constantly changing sea state, at least according to the Coast Guard. So we needed to budget for a slow, steady passage, rather gentle than fast and direct. This was fun, though, and reminded me of the many years boating in the Great Lakes along the Rideau Canal from Kingston to Ottawa. A slightly different journey this time, I have to say. I started my boating as a sailor and then migrated to what they call stink pots, as my diesel cruisers are referred to by the sailing community. But in this little Colombian 22-footer, we'd be replicating what I've done over many other seasons of happy boating in Canada. The only difference was we were heading out into the Pacific looking for a minuscule island in a tiny open boat, something I'm not sure I'd contemplate on Lake Ontario. We had an afterthought, and that was the illegal drug trade that was prevalent in this area. I was thinking carefully about how to cope with a chance encounter, even though our little ship, despite its load of supplies, moved along quite smartly with the 140 horsepower Yamaha on the back. The local drug runners generally use 20 horsepower outboards attached to their tiny dugouts, so there was no problem being outrun one of these, but we certainly couldn't outrun one of the big supply boats with 500 horsepower on the back. After dinner, we talked about this and decided to rent a brace of shotguns, along with 100 rounds of ammunition, which openly demonstrated that we were both fully armed and prepared to use them. We carried the shotguns down to the boat, stashed them in a waterproof bag for the run down the coast to Gorgona. Early next morning, we set off from Guapi's waterfront and motored west down the estuary towards the Pacific Ocean. The jungle on each side was incredibly lush, with many outboards sliding out from tiny feeder streams which presumably led to several inland villages. We then paused for a few minutes, loaded some shells into the shotguns, and fired off a few practice shots. We didn't actually need the target practice, I can assure you, but what we did need was to let any of the minor drug runners in the area know that we were armed and to keep their distance because we were prepared to defend the ship. Once around the bend from Guapi, there was a complete lack of habitation, and I marveled at the magnificent tropical landscape and how verdant this part of Colombia is. My traveling companions from the agency were a cheerful mob. We had just eaten a great Colombian breakfast, several cups of excellent coffee, were singing away as we went over the Pacific, so the company was relaxed and the speed of the boat cooled the air as we headed west looking for Isla Gorgona. Many tropical islands have a halo of cloud above their peaks. This is caused by evaporating moisture from the vegetation below. And I hope Gorgona might also be the same, because it would be a wonderful beacon as we motored west out into the wide blue yonder. Looking at the GPS, I calculated the peak was about 1,100 feet above sea level, and considering our speed, I thought we should see the peak in about an hour. We sped westward on the long Pacific swells, the Yamaha roaring over the transom and occasionally showing its age by developing an intermittent mist that was instantly cleared. The weather was really good, no sign of the predicted north-south swells the Coast Guard had told us about, and it felt good to be on the ocean, alive and in a well-founded boat with plenty of supplies and a warm breeze in our faces. The Yamaha then coughed and cleared, but then it repeated the cough and misfired several times as we swayed gently forward in harmonic unison as it stopped. We were dead in the water. This was not the most hospitable selection of ocean in which to lose power, and the GPS told me we'd covered 33% of the ground, meaning Isla Gorgona was still 30 nautical miles ahead. But I've repaired a few outboards over the years, and as we packed a repair kit and some tools, this seemed like an interesting diversion. And after all that planning, we weren't going to allow a dirty carburetor to put us off our course. There is no indigenous habitation on Gorgona, but there are a number of temporary residents, and they crowded the waterfront, and in no time 15 pairs of hands lifted us on our boat clean out of the Pacific and onto the steep pebble beach, where I first saw Isla Gorgona in the flesh. Something rang a bell in my mind as we were being pulled ashore, and that was the Greek mythology and the Greek god Gorgon with the horrific face and a head full of snakes. What on earth was I coming to by coming to Gorgona? But the island looked beautiful and in some respects stereotypical of the Pacific islands we see in the movies. The travel brochures, lush jungles, climbing a steep mountainside, blue water crashing on all sides of the island, and the climate was warm and heavy and tropical. But something was missing, and there were no beaches anywhere on the island. Instead, it is ringed with steep pebble slopes and sharp rocks that would tear the sturdiest ship apart in no time. There was a 2,000-foot wide bay fronting the modest village, which gently curved, and 200 feet offshore, we recorded 300 feet of water. This was ideal for anchoring our little cruise ship, and Gorgona seemed like an interesting destination. The island was being studied by a group of scientists for its unique animal and plant life. So those studious types were visiting in shifts, which gave me an opportunity to quiz them. And although this is a nature-based paradise, one that on the surface looks terribly inviting, Isla Gorgona was quite notorious for its secret role as a former penal colony. The island's role as a jail started in 1958 and was eventually able to accommodate 1,500 prisoners who were transported from the mainland in the stinking cargo holds of a freighter. This overgrown Pacific rock was teeming with wildlife, mostly aggressive monkeys, and lending credence to its Greek name, a great variety of snakes. To even contemplate escaping from the penitentiary on Isla Gorgona with its immensely powerful ocean currents, shark-infested waters, poisonous snakes in the nearby jungle, and inhospitable coastline was to contemplate suicide. The Isla Gorgona penal facility was eerily similar to the French penal colony on an island in French Guiana depicted in the movie called Papillon. The movie stars two of my favorite actors, the extraordinary Steve McQueen in the role of Henri Charrière, and Dustin Hoffman, who played the role of his sidekick, Degas. The movie Papillon focuses on the exploits of Charrière and Degas, who are serial escapers and forced laborers on this island. McQueen is an irascible character, as we all know, and his ability to plan escapes while under huge mental and physical pressure makes for a very entertaining movie. The overt plot of racism and the complex relationship between the two main characters weaves an interesting story for movie enthusiasts, and this is vintage Steve McQueen with Hoffman playing the perfect foil. In the late 19th century, another famous resident incarcerated on Devil's Island, this was Alfred Dreyfus, whose trial and ordeal commenced in 1894 and continued until its conclusion in 1906. The so-called Dreyfus affair rocked France when this young French artillery officer was wrongly accused of treason. France at that time was rampantly anti-Semitic, and although Dreyfus was exonerated, the real culprit was discovered. He spent 5 terrifying years in French Guiana. What catalyzed his defense was the famous letter penned by Émile Zola, titled J'accuse, and other supporters of Dreyfus included Anatole France and Georges Clemenceau, who pressured the French government to reopen the case and eventually find Dreyfus innocent. The similarities between these two environments are striking. However, one Colombian prisoner did manage to escape from Gorgona, and that was Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Barbosa was a serial murderer of young women and was finally caught and sent out to Gorgona as one of the prisoners in the holds of those prison ships. He was a serial murderer of young women across Colombia, and after his successful escape, he continued his rampage in nearby Ecuador. Consider for a moment what Barbosa had to overcome to make his getaway from Gorgona. The prison must have been a dreadful place for anyone to be incarcerated, and its current decaying state, it looks even more foreboding than some of the archival pictures I've seen. Although the jungle is rapidly reclaiming this terrible prison, you can get some idea of the stark grey concrete buildings and the dormitories with razor wire separating the bunks and some of the punishment blocks from these photographs. All these years later, it is still a terrifying place to walk through, You can almost hear the ghosts of the prisoners shouting out as they're incarcerated in these 1 meter wide incarceration holes. When it was operating, there were several disciplinary actions imposed by the authorities, and the prisoners were compelled to do all of the manual work, including the upkeep of the infrastructure and the maintenance of the farm. He first had to secretly construct a primitive boat that was some degree ocean capable. He had to somehow study the ocean currents in camera so he knew where they might take him onto the mainland. He had to secretly plot a marine route to account for the vicious Pacific drift which came north-south, and in total secrecy he needed to cache sufficient food and possibly camouflage civilian clothing for his arrival on the mainland. And above all, he needed critical lead time to make his escape before the guards noticed he had gone. Barbosa correctly surmised the guides would focus their search on the island and not for one moment think he'd escaped by sea. The guards in the colony spent some considerable time looking across the island, but they surmised that he'd probably escaped by sea and been eaten by the sharks which maraud close to the mainland. That misconception bought him quite a bit of time and allowed him to put distance between his tiny boat and the prison, and made his way to Guayaquil in Ecuador. The psychopath returned to his former crimes, and soon the police were looking for an entire gang, believing no single person could be responsible for such a monstrous crime wave. Barbosa was eventually arrested in Quito, Ecuador, where a medical expert concluded he was exceptionally intelligent, surprisingly well-read, amazingly inventive, and totally without remorse. The sleeping blocks in the prison resembled the wooden tiered bunks we've seen in photos of concentration camps in Belsen and Dachau, with razor wire separating the rows of bunks to maintain order between the prisoners. The washing facilities were crude, open-air circular, cast stone shallow baths resembling animal troughs, and the punishment block was as severe as one can imagine. In 40 degrees C and high Pacific Island humidity, the offending prisoners were stuffed into cells 1 meter wide for weeks on end. There was no way they could sit down, there was no way they could bend, and they were compelled to stand with no possibility of leaning more than 5 degrees from the vertical. Life must have been dreadful for the prisoners on Gorgona, and with sadistic guards, one can only imagine what the outcomes would have been. The jungle is now reclaiming the prison, as steel-grey, sinuous branches creep out from ancient trees, embracing the walls and crushing them inward, and several aggressive troops of monkeys have now claimed the prison as their walled city. And as we were closely followed by these little sentries, each time I walked through the gates, the monkeys kept their distance, but with gangs of 50 simians following me and with razor-sharp teeth, I thought twice about wandering through there alone. In fact, while I was on Gorgona, I witnessed several gang fights between these monkeys and saw several of them dead, dragged back into the undergrowth, presumably by young cannibals who were hoping to eat them. The time in Gorgona was fascinating, and it was abundantly clear that this was a place we could introduce to the expedition cruise industry if we could somehow develop a reasonable way of getting people ashore. I had a reasonable Wi-Fi connection. I was able to connect with family back home to share this extraordinary island and to explain exactly what I was doing. He was on a dive mission a couple of years back and told me an extraordinary story of when he put into the mainland to replenish the water tanks on his little boat. At this point, Eric had a couple of European clients who were diving in the area, and they needed to replenish their water tank, and basically visited a small village just north of Buenaventura. The coastline was covered with mangroves. They had to push their way through, but eventually they were confronted with a fairly high berm of earth, which seemed to stretch for about 300 meters in each direction, forming a large square. So they climbed the berm and found the most extraordinary sight, with several thousand steel jerrycans rusting in the sunshine. These jerrycans all had German naval markings, And when they unraveled the story, they went back to the time when Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. The Axis had German submarines operating in the Pacific, and what they surmised was this was a refueling base hidden on the Colombian coastline, out of sight, well inland, and almost impossible to spot from the sea. As my visit to Gorgona wrapped up, I was reflecting on how unique this tiny island is for its flora and fauna, its extraordinary prison history, and just the sheer beauty of its location. We packed up and reversed the journey, the Yamaha working absolutely perfectly for the entire trip back to Guapi. We overnighted in the same decrepit little hotel, and next day caught Satena back into Cartagena. Colombia is an extraordinary country, and I have been there a number of times since, and would have absolutely no hesitation in recommending it for a vacation. It has wonderful, welcoming people, extraordinary flora and fauna, and has, in my view, a great future in tourism. Thank you for joining me on this story for grown-ups. I hope you've enjoyed the experience, and we'll tune in again soon. Take good care.